Have you ever made a decision so fundamentally wrong that it still keeps you awake at night years later? Kyle Dubas probably has, and it involves a 6'5" power forward named Mason Marchment, who could have been the missing piece that finally broke Toronto's Stanley Cup drought. Instead, on February 19, 2020, Dubas traded away what might have been the Maple Leafs' next Zach Hyman for a forgettable player who barely registered a blip on the NHL radar. This isn't just another case of hindsight being 2020ths. This is a masterclass in how even the most analytically minded general managers can overthink their way into catastrophic mistakes. The trade of Mason Marchment-Denis Malgin represents everything wrong with modern NHL thinking, sacrificing size, grit, and potential for the illusion of skill that never materialized. What makes this trade particularly infuriating isn't just what Toronto lost, but what they gained: absolutely nothing. While Marchment has evolved into a legitimate NHL power forward with multiple 20-goal seasons, Malgin became little more than a salary cap footnote. It's the kind of transaction that makes you question whether front offices actually watch their own prospects develop. The Dubas paradox, brilliance and blindness in equal measure. Kyle Dubas deserves credit for revolutionizing how the Maple Leafs approach talent development. His work with the Toronto Marlies produced a Calder Cup championship and a conveyor belt of NHL-ready players that most organizations would kill for. Zach Hyman, Connor Brown, Kasperi Kapanen, Andreas Johnson, Travis Dermott, Timothy Liljegren, Rasmus Sandin, and Justin Hall all emerged from his development system. This track record makes the Marchment trade even more baffling. Dubas understood better than anyone how to identify and nurture prospects who could contribute at the NHL level. He had watched Marchment's skating improve year after year in the AHL, witnessed his clutch performances in big moments, and even saw him score the Calder Cup-winning goal in 2018. Yet somehow, this same executive who built a championship-caliber farm system decided that a 6'5", 215-pound forward with legitimate NHL upside was worth trading for Denis Malgin, a 5'9", 180-pound player whose skill never translated to meaningful NHL production. The contradiction reveals a fundamental flaw in Dubas' evaluation process. He could develop players brilliantly, but occasionally lost sight of their actual value when making roster decisions. The Marchment trade represents the worst aspects of overthinking, abandoning a proven internal development success for the perceived sophistication of acquiring an NHL-ready player. Marchment's trajectory. The late bloomer who bloomed, Mason Marchment's development story reads like a textbook case of why patience pays off in prospect evaluation. The son of former NHL tough guy Brian Marchment, Mason inherited his father's size and willingness to play in traffic, but needed time to develop the skating and skill necessary for modern NHL success. His AHL production never screamed future star, never more than 13 goals in a single season. But the underlying indicators were encouraging. His skating improved annually, his positioning in dirty areas created scoring chances, and his performance in crucial moments suggested someone who thrived under pressure. The 2018 Calder Cup run showcased everything scouts loved about Marchment's potential. Scoring the championship-winning goal demonstrated his ability to deliver in the biggest moments, while his physical presence throughout the playoffs showed he could impact games beyond just scoring. What Toronto failed to recognize was that Marchment represented exactly the type of player their core needed. Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner are elite skill players who benefit enormously from having a physical presence who can create space and finish around the net. Marchment could have been their perfect complementary piece. Instead, they traded him for a player who possessed none of these qualities and couldn't even establish himself as a regular NHL player. It's asset management at its absolute worst, trading away upside for immediate mediocrity. The Malgin mirage. When skill doesn't translate, Denis Malgin's acquisition represented everything wrong with how NHL teams evaluate skilled players. On paper, his offensive production with the Florida Panthers suggested a player who could contribute immediately to Toronto's lineup. In reality, he was a player whose skill set didn't translate to winning hockey at the NHL level. The obsession with Malgin's offensive numbers ignored crucial context about his defensive limitations, physical shortcomings, and inability to impact games when they mattered most. His 5'9", 180-pound frame simply couldn't handle the physical demands of playoff hockey, making him essentially useless when the Maple Leafs needed him most. This type of evaluation error reflects a broader problem in modern hockey analysis. Teams become so focused on offensive production that they ignore the physical and mental attributes necessary for postseason success. Malgin's regular season numbers meant nothing if he couldn't contribute during the playoffs. The trade essentially swapped a player who could have thrived in playoff battles for one who wilted under pressure. Given Toronto's consistent playoff struggles, this represents particularly poor judgment about what type of player could actually help them achieve their championship goals. The philosophical failure. Size versus skill in modern hockey, the Marchment-Malgin trade encapsulates a fundamental misunderstanding about how successful NHL teams are constructed. While skill undoubtedly matters, playoff success requires players who can maintain their effectiveness when games become more physical and intense. Dubas' decision to prioritize Malgin's perceived skill over Marchment's size and potential revealed a philosophical blind spot that may have cost Toronto multiple playoff series. The Maple Leafs consistently struggled against more physical opponents, and Marchment's presence could have provided exactly the type of player who thrives in those situations. The irony is that Dubas generally understood this balance better than most executives. His 2022-23 team featured players like Ryan O'Reilly who combined skill with physical presence, creating the most complete Maple Leafs roster in recent memory. The Marchment trade represents a deviation from his usual sound judgment. This philosophical inconsistency highlights how even excellent executives can make decisions that contradict their own successful strategies. The Marchment trade wasn't just a bad evaluation, it was a betrayal of the developmental philosophy that had made Dubas successful. The ripple effects. How one trade changed everything. The impact of losing Marchment extends far beyond just missing one player's contributions. His presence could have fundamentally altered Toronto's roster construction and playoff approach, potentially changing their entire competitive trajectory. Imagine a forward group featuring Marchment alongside Matthews and Marner, with Matthew Knies supporting John Tavares and William Nylander. This configuration would have provided the physical presence and net front scoring that Toronto consistently lacked in crucial playoff moments. Marchment's development into a legitimate 20-goal scorer proves this wasn't just wishful thinking. He possessed the exact skill set that could have complemented Toronto's star players while providing the playoff-style hockey that their core players needed around them. The trade also represents a broader failure to maximize internal development. Dubas had invested years in Marchment's growth, watched him succeed at every level, and then abandoned that investment for a player who couldn't even establish himself as a regular NHL contributor. The alternative timeline. What could have been in an alternate universe where Dubas kept Marchment, the Maple Leafs might have finally broken through their playoff ceiling. His physical presence, combined with his emerging offensive ability, could have been the difference in their numerous close series losses. Marchment's current production, multiple 20-goal seasons, suggests he could have been a legitimate second-line contributor for Toronto. His ability to score from the slot and create havoc in front of the net represents exactly what the Maple Leafs have been missing in their playoff disappointments. The chemistry between Marchment and Toronto's core players could have developed into something special. His willingness to go to dirty areas would have created more space for Matthews and Marner, while his size could have provided protection and intimidation that their skilled players desperately needed. Instead, Toronto spent years trying to find external solutions for problems that Marchment could have addressed internally. The trade forced them to repeatedly seek power forwards through free agency and trades, often overpaying for players who couldn't match what Marchment eventually became. The lesson: internal development versus external acquisition. The Marchment trade serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of trusting internal development over external acquisition. Dubas had successfully developed Marchment through Toronto's system, understood his strengths and potential, and then abandoned that knowledge for the perceived sophistication of acquiring an established NHL player. This decision reflects a common organizational mistake, undervaluing internal assets while overvaluing external options. The familiarity with Marchment's limitations made him seem less attractive than Malgin's unknown potential, when the opposite should have been true. The trade also highlights the importance of patience in player development. Marchment needed time to fully develop his skating and offensive skills, but his trajectory was clearly pointing upward. Trading him represented a failure to see the forest for the trees, focusing on immediate production rather than long-term potential. The lasting impact. A decision that defined a tenure. While the Marchment trade alone didn't prevent Toronto from winning a Stanley Cup, it represents the type of marginal decision that can determine championship success. In a league where talent margins are razor-thin, giving away a potential 20-goal scorer for nothing represents organizational malpractice. The trade also damaged Dubas' reputation as a development-focused executive. His greatest strength was identifying and nurturing talent, but the Marchment decision suggested he could be swayed by external factors rather than trusting his own evaluation process. For Toronto fans, the trade represents everything frustrating about their team's recent history. They consistently find ways to make themselves worse through questionable decisions, and the Marchment trade stands as perhaps the most egregious example of this self-sabotage. The trade will likely be remembered as Kyle Dubas' worst decision as Toronto's general manager, not because it was the most impactful, but because it represented such a fundamental betrayal of his own successful philosophy. In trying to get too clever, he threw away exactly the type of player who could have helped Toronto achieve their championship dreams. This whole situation makes me wonder about the broader question of player evaluation in modern hockey. Are teams getting too caught up in advanced stats and skilled players while ignoring the physical and mental attributes that actually win championships? Should Toronto have stuck with their internal development rather than chasing the illusion of immediate improvement? The Marchment trade feels like a perfect example of how even smart executives can outsmart themselves into making terrible decisions. What's your take on this trade and whether size and grit still matter in today's NHL? Share your thoughts below, because this debate goes way beyond just one transaction. It's about how teams should build for playoff success. If this breakdown of Toronto's biggest mistake got you thinking about your own team's questionable moves, hit that like button and let's keep dissecting the decisions that shape our favorite franchises.